Hello everyone, and welcome to Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on the Introduction to the Gospels, religious background of the intertestamental period. Now before I begin, I just wanted to let everybody know that I have been having computer difficulties. It's entirely possible that my 13-year-old PC is on its way out, and so if the stream just dies, it's probably because my computer died as well, as it did earlier today. So if that happens, I'll just probably refilm it or something like that at a later time. But for now, we're going to go ahead and hopefully we will be able to maintain. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. This is going to be a lot of fun tonight. We're going through the religious background of the intertestamental period. There is a lot here. We may end up splitting this into two sessions. I don't know. We'll have to see how long it takes to get through. But there is a lot to talk about. And I think I'll even be making comments. I think as we continue to examine these things, I think you're going to find that there's a lot of parallels to the modern day. And I hope that gives us hope, because oftentimes when we are working in the modern day in evangelism and trying to do church and ministry, we can get bogged down and we can get a little discouraged because of how difficult it can often seem and how much we're fighting against, it seems like, at every corner. And they were dealing with similar things back then. And so I think there's a bit of encouragement that can be found by looking at some of this information. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to take a look at both the Hellenistic religions, I should say, and the Jewish religions of the intertestamental period and the time leading up to Jesus' arrival. So in the ancient Mediterranean world, you had a wide variety of religions. It was massively pluralistic, massively syncretistic. Almost every religion in the first century, additionally, has a modern-day counterpart. Now, what you're going to do is, as I go through these, I want you to be asking some questions. First, which religions do have modern-day counterparts? But then secondarily, on top of that, how do we see syncretism with some of these things in Christianity today? And I think that's in even some sense even a more interesting question. So first we'll go ahead and dive into the Hellenistic religion. And what you have to understand is that, kind of like the Enlightenment period and also the postmodern period, that the first century was kind of a time of crisis. There was a lot of just individual unrest and societal unrest. Old worldviews and ideologies were becoming outmoded. There were new cults springing up all the time. And the reason why is because people were being uprooted from their traditional homelands and where they'd lived in their countries, and they were being moved. Remember, the Jewish people had been carted off, at least part of them had carted off to Babylon for a time, carted off to different places, Persia. They'd been essentially dispersed. This was happening with various peoples all throughout the region. And so what would happen is, in these new areas, they were encountering conflicting truth claims upon their resettlement in these new areas, and they were having to figure out, how are we going to move forward? So it was tough. And this essentially created a pluralism that very few things were even trying to resist. In fact, really, pluralism was only really ever resisted by Judaism and what would become Christianity. And so you're seeing this pluralistic side develop because peoples are being mixed, it's multicultural, everything's got a Hellenistic flair to it. Right? As a Hellenistic flair, we're going to learn about that as well. And as a result, you're getting all of these conflicting ideologies, and people are just trying to figure out how to get by, how to move forward. Because again, their traditional thinking is kind of being deconstructed. Now, the first aspect of religion in that time that I'd like to talk about is the traditional mythology. And this really reached its main height of popularity in the 4th and 5th century BC. Now, this is the pantheon of gods. And what's interesting is people did actually believe in the pantheon of gods. In fact, again, 4th, 5th century, this was at an all-time high. People in Greece and things definitely were invested into the real belief in the gods, things of that nature. However, you're going to get Rome conquering Greece. You're going to see that they give the gods Latin names. And additionally, you're also going to see some science begin to develop, right? Rome is going to be a bastion of science, a bastion of intellectual learning, of philosophy, of construction. And by the time of Rome's dominance, the belief in traditional mythology was declining. Scientific understanding was going to change things. In other words, why did people believe in the gods? Well, the people were very much at the mercy of the elements. They were at the mercy of the rains. They were at the mercy of random chance of having a child. So by believing in these gods, and by convincing themselves of belief in these gods, they were able to control or interact with that which they had no direct control over. And so that's one of the big reasons for the belief in these gods. However, you have to remember these gods were very regional. For example, there was a god of Athens, Athena, there was the god of Sparta. You have all of these different gods over different cities. And because of their geographical limitations, they didn't really catch on in full. Now, Rome did help some of that in creating this pantheon, but still, they were very regional even back then. And again, Rome conquering Greece had a serious impact. Now, the pantheon is actually going to be replaced by the god king. Now, they had god kings even all the way back to the time of Egypt and Babylon. Even Sargon the Great was a god king. And a lot of the god kings claimed they were sons of God. And what you're going to see is Augustus is going to do the same thing. He's going to declare Caesar God, Julius Caesar, and he's going to declare that he was the son of God. So you're going to see this god king develop, and that becomes a central focus of worship. So rather than the pantheon, it becomes this emperor is going to be a focal point of worship. Now, by the 1st century, Greeks and Romans essentially kind of gave paid lip service, really, only to the old mythology. It was really more of a superstition. Now, the myths still had influence, though, in rural and isolated areas. So you got to remember, Rome and the Roman Empire, the city areas, yes, they did. They still had their priests. They still had all their stuff. But it was a little bit more of a lip service. It was a little bit more of a cultural thing at that point, as opposed to a strong belief in the existence of these gods. One interesting point of this can actually be seen, again, in this rural and isolated area, in Lystra. And let's go ahead and read Acts 14:12. I think you'll find this fascinating. Acts 14:12. And they started to call Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the main speaker. They were literally thinking that Paul and Barnabas were the incarnation, if you will, of these gods. So you still had that kind of stuff even in biblical times. And again, the gods were consulted in general. At this point, they were believed to appear to people in their dreams. Again, people would stay overnight in these temples and to be healed at these healing shrines or receive oracles. And oracles were a big deal, even at this point. An oracle was a big deal. You often see this in ancient Roman history. You'll see oracles being given about certain emperors and things, and that's a big, big important thing to declare their success. So you had the Asclepian shrines. This would be the snake god. He would be the god of medicine and recreation and religion and ancient health spa type scenarios where people would go to kind of feel better. The oracle at Delphi is a very famous one. And then the Sibylline oracles as well claim to be able to predict the future and the end of the world. Now, they also had the myths influencing seasonal and annual festivals. So they still had a lot of these festivals going on. The temple rituals. And these, again, were a part of the economy. They were a socioeconomic benefit to local merchants and temple keepers. And you also had, though, the more negative side of this, like the worship of, you had the worship of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt in Ephesus, but you also had the sacred prostitution temple of Aphrodite in Corinth. So, you're getting a lot of immorality around these things as well, but they really are an economic boon, is kind of how people saw them. And so that's essentially the level of influence of traditional mythology at this point. It's waned. It has cultural significance. It has moral significance. But honestly, the philosophers of Greece, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they dealt some, and more, they dealt some very serious blows to mythology by the time of Jesus and the Roman Empire's dominance. Now, mythology is one piece. Another piece of this Hellenistic thought is philosophies. And all major philosophies at this point articulated worldviews about correct behavior as well as belief. Nowadays, people often think of philosophy just as about what you believe, maybe about God, or maybe about the very nature and fabric of reality. But when you actually go back and read, and you do like a history of philosophy course, you find that pretty much all of the philosophers outside of modern day philosophers, it was articulation about what is reality, but ethics was a very major portion. This is going to be true in Socrates. This is going to be true in Plato. All these guys, ethics is a key thing. Immanuel Kant is a more modern, or more later day one. A lot of these guys had their philosophies about God, their philosophies about the world, their philosophies about the nature of things, but then they gave an ethical statement as well. So it was tied to morality. And so these philosophies were very religious in a sense. Okay? Again, the morality permeates these types of philosophies. And oddly enough, when you want to talk about like Christian conversion, the closest thing people had to that, aside from Jewish conversion, was conversion to a philosophy. If you were going to convert, it wasn't really to one of the gods. That was just generally believed, or the mythology, etc. But if you were going to convert to something like a way, you were converting to a philosophy. And again, a lot of this came from Socrates and Plato. And Plato, actually, or Platonism, led to dualism, which is a very, very entrenched philosophy at this point, between matter and spirit. And the argument was that the true reality was the immaterial spirit. Okay? That was the immaterial reality, that matter was really not good in some sense. And salvation then under Platonism would be the escape from this unreal world of matter to the very real world of the spirit by means of knowledge of the highest good or the supreme mind. So in other words, by esoteric knowledge of God or the highest good or the supreme mind, you could essentially attain to a form of salvation or escape from this world. They would argue that sin is ignorance. Okay, so sin is just going to be ignorance about the true nature of things. And again, salvation here would produce a disembodied immortal soul, but not the resurrection of the body. And so it's important to see how even New Age movement in the modern day, and I'm going to make some of these comments throughout, the New Age movement in the modern day has a lot